knowledge more accessible to hundreds of thousands of pilots and maintenance technicians. After an aircraft accident and discovering their own sense of vulnerability, John and Martha say they have become born-again pilots. The Kings use humor and stories from real-world cross-country experiences to vividly illustrate principles of risk management and pass along practical and insightful tools you will use and teach forever. Having won many awards and honors, John and Martha were recently inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame class of 2019. NAFI congratulates them on this outstanding achievement. Now, without further ado, on to our presentation, Straight Talk about Aviation Safety.
Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm Martha King.
And hello, fellow flight instructors. In case there's any confusion about this, I'm John King, and we are standing up. You know, welcome to Straight Talk about Aviation Safety, and we want to say particularly thanks to NAFI for making this venue available to us, and also thank you for including us both in this presentation. You know, Martha and I have been best buddies for over 50 years now. For over 50 years, we've been flying airplanes together. For the last 30 years, we've been flying airplanes that require two pilots. And we just absolutely love it because it's some kind of ballet that we dance together. We think it's just absolutely beautiful. So we do a lot of stuff together, and we're thrilled to be doing this together. So I want to say that a lot of people comment about Martha and I flying together, and I explain she's only a little bit better pilot than I am. And they say I'm lucky that Martha will fly with me. And I say, lucky? What are you talking about, lucky? She wants to fly half the time. It costs us twice as much to keep current, and she's got an opinion about everything.
You know, John likes to think that their relationship exemplifies that old saying that behind every successful man stands a great woman.
Yeah, got that great. You got it right, Martha. It's exactly how I feel about it.
What he doesn't realize is the true saying is that in front of every great woman stands some guy without a clue who's blocking her view.
Well, you know, honest discussions about safety are particularly important for general aviation.
And the reason that they're important for general aviation is that our accident rate is not near as good as it should be. It's a lot worse than the airlines. It's worse than driving. It's on a par with motorcycles. We need to fix that, and we've got some ideas this evening about ways that we think you can help the community fix that, and we think this discussion can save some lives.
You know, we've developed these thoughts we're about to share with you from 45 years of teaching pilots and seeing the results. And we think that discussions about safety often aren't as helpful or as insightful as they can be. Actually, our current way of discussing safety can often be counterproductive. And so we're going to talk about why it might be counterproductive and how we can do better. You know, very often the administrator of the FAA or the Secretary of Transportation will get up after an accident and assure us by saying things like, safety is our #1 priority. There can be no compromise with safety. Well, those are very comforting things to hear, but the problem is they aren't and can't be true, because it's just impossible to do anything in an aircraft without compromising safety. You can't start an engine without compromising safety. So if you move an aircraft from one point to another, that confirms that moving the aircraft ranks ahead of safety. You know, it's like a ship is always safest in the harbor, but that's not what ships are for. So it would always be safer in an airplane to stay put. And so doing anything in an aircraft requires a trade-off between the desired result and some level of risk. And that trade-off varies depending on the circumstances, but there is always that trade-off.
And the trade-off depends in part on the EQ, if you will, of the pilot.
In other words, the emotional intelligence of the pilot and how they make their decisions about giving up things that they want because they have to manage risk. Now, we have one administrator a few years back said that there can only be one level of safety. There'd been an accident in a small airplane, and he wanted to ensure people who flew in commuters that to assure them that we're not going to allow a lower level of safety for commuters. But the problem is, you can't just have one level of safety. It can't be true. And the reason it can't be true is safety costs money and requires heavier equipment. You know, a Piper Cub will never be as safe as a 747.
It's just not possible.
And the problem with all of these discussions that are intellectually dishonest is that they tend to take up the space for thoughtful conversation. They substitute for thoughtful conversation. So therefore, we don't have as thoughtful and as reasoned discussions as we should have on the subject. Martha and I have a friend who used to be chairman of the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. That's the Australian equivalent of the rule-making part of the FAA. And he was the equivalent of the administrator of the FAA, but he was a general aviation pilot. He was also a provocative person, and he scared people. And the reason he scared people is that people wish to say there could be safety. He used to talk about, he wanted people to know that safety costs money. You can only have affordable safety. If it's not affordable, people aren't going to do it, and you're not going to have the safety. So he steered people away from disingenuous talk about safety. He advocated what they call affordable safety, and to get the idea of safety costs money bothered people. People often will say that that you can't put a price on safety. The answer is you can put a price on safety because safety costs money. Now,
one of the examples that he would use often is he would be talking about the Australian outback, and he would be saying, look, if you make it too expensive for people to travel from one place to another in a small airplane, they're going to drive instead, and they're going to have a lot of problems on the roads. If they're in a commuter, they're going to be safer than they would be on driving. And so we need to remember that safety has to be affordable, or we're just shooting ourselves in the foot.
Now, folks, this is a good spot. We've said some provocative things already. Is anybody who would like to have a question or wants to argue with something Martha might have said?
John, you haven't let me say hardly anything.
Yeah, but it's worth arguing with.
JD, do we have any comments or questions yet?
Yes, Martha, we do have a comment. The comment is from Santosh, who says, Part 91 general aviation is 7 times more dangerous than driving, according to his FAA FSDO safety team.
We agree with that totally, and the 7 times more dangerous than driving puts it, as I said a little bit earlier, on a par with motorcycles.
It's Martha and I have been through those numbers, and we're talking about the fatality rate per mile. When we talk about it's 7 times, you're 7 times more likely to be involved in a fatality per mile in an aircraft, the general aviation aircraft, than you are a car. So we're talking about the fatality rate per mile.
Now, airlines are fabulously safe. I mean, it's been ages since we've had a major airline accident with any fatalities in
well,
a crash.
we've had the 2, the 737 MAX, so it's not ages anymore.
Well, in the U.S.
Yeah, okay. All right, okay.
In the U.S.
All right, okay. All right, I'll let you get away with that.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. But
Okay.
so that is, airline travel in the U.S. is much safer than driving, but GA travel is not. And we'll never get there to where the airlines are because we can't afford, either from a weight standpoint or a cost standpoint, the kind of safety equipment and backing in terms of the whole infrastructure that airlines have. But we can get better than we are, and we need to.
JD, do we have any other questions?
I do. I have a question here from Brett, who said he'd be very interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on the top 3 things to do or not to do in order to be safer general aviation pilots.
Well, actually, we're going to cover that.
We're going to give some tips and some tools.
And basically, The first one is to be risk aware and be willing to give up on what you want to do in order to mitigate risk.
We're going to talk about goal orientation as we go along here.
We got a whole bunch of goal-oriented people here, and goal orientation is a wonderful thing in most of life. But in an aircraft, being too goal-oriented can be risky because you hate to give up on a goal, and therefore you'll take risks to not give up on a goal. Let's go ahead and talk about this. Continue a little bit for a while here, Martha.
One of the problems of the way safety advice is given a lot in general aviation is that people will tend to talk down to the pilots that they're working with. And just the language and the vocabulary will often come across as being preachy, being smug, being superior. You don't know as much as I do about being a safe pilot. And that can feel like, to the learning pilot or even just an active pilot who's getting feedback from somebody, it can feel demeaning and offensive, like unwarranted criticism. And one of the problems with the way a lot of safety advice is given in general aviation is it doesn't give really guidance and it doesn't give standards, and we need that. The problem is that the vocabulary that's used a lot of times when we're trying to convey stuff about safety, and John will have some thoughts about that word, is it's not acceptable to the listener. We use terms like aeronautical decision making and judgment and the 5 hazardous attitudes. And
Martha tells me I have 4 of the 5 hazardous attitudes. The only one I don't have
is resignation. That's absolutely true. The problem with the aeronautical decision making and judgment and the 5 hazardous attitudes, that vocabulary is, again, they don't provide guidance and they don't provide standards. So aeronautical decision making tends to have kind of a smug,
like you can't make a decision.
Right. You know, here you are, perhaps a business executive, certainly someone who's successful in their life. If they're going to be able to go out and learn to fly or to be a pilot, and it leaves the feeling, some of the language about aeronautical decision making, that as John says, you don't know how to make a decision. And can you visualize the 20-year-old flight instructor talking to a 45-year-old business owner and say, today I'm going to teach you to make aeronautical decisions? The point is not bad, but the language, the vocabulary tends to put up a barrier so that the message doesn't get transferred. And the term aeronautical decision making tends to be reactive and implies that you come to a decision point and at that point you have to make a yes/no decision.
Rather than being that reactive, our thought would be to be ahead of it. You don't come to a decision point and make a decision. Also, if someone says you're a failure at aeronautical decision making, where do you go from there? What's the guidance? What standards are there? How is it going to help you to have someone tell you you're a failure at aeronautical decision making? So I don't think it's a particularly helpful vocabulary.
And we're going to talk about what we think is a better vocabulary, particularly one that focuses on the concept of risk management. And risk management is a proactive habit of being able to identify risks and to mitigate those risks, and doing it continuously as a habit in every part of your flying.
So rather than getting to a kind of a decision point and making a decision, what we're saying is we should proactively practice risk management, where you get ahead of and identify the risk and come up with a mitigation plan for the risk. So the whole key that we think we need to work on here is clear and honest language that's straightforward, that's honest and doesn't substitute for a good vocabulary that's going to help people. So we want to give people positive guidance rather than being reactive. So that's why we think we should talk about risk management. And safety is an outcome. It's not it's not a cause. It's the result when you practice risk management. And risk management is how you get there when you're talking about safety. For instance, the United States Air Force and the Civil Air Patrol, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other organizations, talk about mission first, safety always. You can't talk about it as your number one priority because obviously the mission has to be number one priority in some cases, but but risk management while you perform that mission.
And that's an example of the clear and honest language we're
Correct,
talking about. The mission is first, but we have to do it as safely as we possibly can.
So you do them both together at the same time,
Right.
and you practice habitual risk management. But I'm going to say this. The risks in flying, if they're left unmanaged, are unacceptable. And what I would like to do, folks, is I would like to take a poll right now, and I would like for you to go to pollev.com/NAFI, and I'm going to ask you a question. And when I ask you that question, I would like you to go to this location and answer it yes or no.
So log in now on your iPhone or iPad or something other than what you're watching this webinar on to pollev.com/NAFI, and you'll see this identical question come up.
Okay.
And answer it yes or no.
And here is the question. How many in this group know someone personally who was killed in a general aviation accident? If you know someone who was killed personally, who was killed in a general aviation accident, answer yes, and we're going to get the results back.
And we'll feed them back to you, but we'll take a few minutes to gather that information.
While we're gathering that information, I want to continue for just a little bit. And I want to talk about innovations, because this whole idea of our focusing on risk management is new, and by definition, that makes it an innovation. And all innovations seem simple and obvious in hindsight. For instance, the astronauts, when they got back from the moon and flew on the airlines, had to carry their luggage because there were no wheels on luggage. We had not actually started using wheels on luggage. Now, wheels on luggage is pretty simple and obvious in hindsight.
Almost everybody's got it now.
But we went for millennia. We went for over 100 years flying on the airlines without wheels on luggage. So we're going to talk about something, and you're going to say, well, duh, what's the big deal? Well, that's like wheels on luggage. It seems simple and obvious in hindsight. So let's talk about it. And what we're going to talk about is risk management tools, and we're going to talk about a vocabulary for situational awareness. And with the FAA, Martha and I developed PAVE and CARE with a guy named Roger Baker, who was in charge of safety programs for the FAA. And PAVE you use to proactively think about the risks before you go on a flight. And PAVE stands for putting risks in the categories of the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and external pressures.
So
and
what we use this for, what we'd like for you to think about using this for, but most importantly, think about teaching your students to use, is when you're planning a flight to help your learning pilots look at the possible risks and put them into the categories of pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. And once they've got them in those categories, it will be much easier for them to assess how much risk is there and figure out how to mitigate this risk. So PAVE is basically a pre-flight planning tool that you can use with your learning pilots.
And putting them in the categories just helps you think of the categories of risk, and it's a proactive way of thinking where the risks might be. What you want to do is, when you're doing this, you're actively maintaining situational awareness. What's going on regarding the pilot? What's going on regarding the aircraft, and so on.
Once you're airborne.
Then when you get airborne, everything you planned on with PAVE changes. because flying is dynamic. It's flying an airplane, it's getting lower on fuel, over changing terrain, moving from one place to another, over changing weather with a pilot who's getting more fatigued. Everything about flying is dynamic. So immediately, as soon as you get airborne, everything starts to change. We've got C care to deal with this. This first C stands for the changes, and care tells you to think about the consequences of those changes, the changes in your alternatives, the reality, the new reality that you're in, and the external pressures change. It's harder to give up on a trip the closer you get to your destination. So as you go along, it's harder to give up on doing something right.
Those internal pressures and your own internal goal orientation get stronger and stronger, and that's where the EQ, the emotional quotient, that we all need to have a high emotional quotient as a pilot, comes in regarding how do we handle these pressures on us.
JD, do we have the results from our poll yet?
Yes, I do have some polling results right now. And what I'm seeing is 65% of people that have responded have said yes to that question.
That they knew someone personally. Do you have the absolute numbers, how many people it is, or do you
right now we're at 185 total people that have responded.
Okay, and of those 185, how many said yes, how many said no? I could do the math, I'm just not able to do it in my head here.
No worries, John. We have 121 yes and 64 no.
121 yes and 64
okay.
no. Okay,
so if you haven't participated in the poll yet, please go to pollev.com/NAFI.
You're in trouble now.
Now,
is it forward slant or back?
Forward slant.
NAFI.
And enter your answer to that question, and we'll see if it changes any as we go along.
Okay.
And JD, do we have any other questions or comments at this point?
Yes, we do, Martha. I've got Robert K. here who was asking, he was making a comment, as aircraft are getting older, he's finding that more of these aircraft are having accidents.
Well, certainly aircraft are getting older, and you go to Oshkosh, and it's hard to figure out which is older, the people or the aircraft. We're all old there. So that's the state of general aviation. We're making new airplanes, but they're getting a lot of the airplanes around the airport are pretty old, and it just requires just proactive maintenance of the aircraft. You can't just be reactive about it.
One of the things that gets to be a risk factor as time goes on with an aircraft is it gets cheaper and cheaper to buy, but it doesn't get cheaper to maintain. It actually gets more expensive to maintain. And what sometimes happens is someone who can afford to buy an aircraft doesn't really consider the cost of maintaining it, particularly if it's an older aircraft. And that can be a really bad combination.
Okay, let's go on, Martha.
Okay.
Now, we talked earlier that goal orientation in most of life is a wonderful thing, but this business of these, the external pressures, you hate to give up on a goal. You told somebody you were going to be there, and I think the biggest risk factor in all of aviation is right here between the ears, and it's a lack of willingness to give up on a goal. It's a huge risk, and that's the biggest management problem we have as we do this.
Because that goal orientation keeps pushing us and says, you can make it, you've got enough fuel, you're close enough, the weather's going to be good enough, so the wind over the mountain won't be that bad.
The goal orientation tends to make us keep on going when good risk mitigation says we should change our plan. Now, as a community, we have come out with the AIRMAN certification standards. And the AIRMAN certification standards replaces the practical test standards, which were standards for a flight test. The AIRMAN certification standards are really standards to be a pilot. And for the very first time now, when we evaluate pilots, we require them to demonstrate their ability to identify and mitigate risk. And so this vocabulary is changing. We're going to take a look at a graph in a little bit to see the results of that. The Airman certification standards are incorporating this risk management, and they are the controlling guidance for everything a pilot is required to know, consider, and do. And they are also the standards that we're going to use in the FAA handbooks. The handbooks reflect the Airman certification standards, not the other way around. People write the handbooks based on what's in the Airman certification standards. So for the first time, we now have standards for the knowledge. The FAA used to ask some terrible FAA knowledge test questions, and now we're just doing we asked pilots to make trivial distinctions, and we're now asking pilots to make more substantial distinctions. We're doing a better job on the standards for knowledge.
But before you go on, John,
Yeah.
one of the points I'd like to make, because I've heard this come up with flight instructors, how come we let the FAA do the ACS to us? And it's not something that was done to us as a community, and you can speak to that. It's what the community, with the cooperation of the FAA, produced from their own concerns and what they were worried about.
Well, I think in part, the Airman certification standards grew out of concerns about very poor questions on the knowledge test. And we have been working for 8 years. I've been a part of it for 8 years, where we've been going to Washington, D.C. for 4 times a year and collaborating with the FAA and coming up with these standards. First, we had a lot of argument with each other to begin with. And as time went on, we listened to each other better. And now we have standards for the risk involved, managing risk, standards for knowledge. We're just doing a lot better job, and I like the Airman certification standards a lot.
So it's a community effort. It's nothing that was handed down to us on high from the FAA.
And as I said earlier, now for the very first time, we're requiring applicants to identify and mitigate risk, and to demonstrate their ability to do that. And as a result of this, we now have a richer and expanded and a better vocabulary. And we're talking about the right things, and talking about risk is the right thing. It's how you get a safe result as you identify risk. The definition of safety is without risk or harm. And so it's this managing risk is how you get safety. So these standards for risk management in the Airman certification standards provide needed guidance to instructors and evaluators, and we convert formerly subjective areas into objective ones, actually give standards for them, and we're establishing risk management as a habitual process. So, and as if you're an evaluator, an examiner on a practical test, you don't want to see them do exactly the way to mitigate risk, because every situation is different. But what you want to do is, what you want to see is their ability to habitually manage risk. Do they have a habit of risk management?
Do they have a process that they go through? And this process is what you can help your learning pilots with to get that down.
A lot of people say that you can't train attitudes. No, but you can train habits, and habits then change attitudes.
Habits are easier to teach and easier to evaluate than attitudes. And as John says, habits then change those attitudes. And examples of some of the aviation habits that we all have in the community are pre-flights. Meticulously going over the aircraft, inspecting it before we take it up in the air, using checklists, fastening seat belts, checking the flight controls, and many, many, many more. And the point is that risk management is just another habit, a very important habit, that will serve pilots well once they learn it well for the rest of their flying career. And the best way to teach those risk management habits, we believe, and the FAA believes, is through scenario-based training. Scenario-based training is the ideal way for a learning pilot to develop the habits of maintaining situational awareness and active risk identification, figuring out what the risks are out there and what how they need to mitigate that, what they need
Let's
to
look at the
do.
results of all of this.
Okay, why don't you do this,
This
John?
is a GA fatal accident rate, fatalities per 100,000 hours. These are the years down at the bottom, and this is the fatal accident rate. And you'll notice at about 2014, there's an inflection point in this curve. All of a sudden, everything got better. And that's when we started doing scenario-based training and airman certification standards. That's when we changed our vocabulary to talk about risk. And I think it's made a huge difference and saved a lot of lives. So I think this has made a huge difference. And I think we're doing good things all together.
It's a cause for optimism.
Right.
It's still not as good as we want, but it's a lot better than it has been, and the trend looks very good.
JD, do we have some more questions to talk about?
I do have some more questions.
Okay.
I've got a question here from Paul, a comment and a question. He says, I think these ideas are good, but way over the heads of most CFIs, and wants to know what your response would be to that.
Well, I hope we have a better opinion of CFIs than that. I think the concept of risk, if it's way over the head of most CFIs, Martha and I aren't explaining it right, because I think the idea that of identifying risk and trying to come up a plan to mitigate risk is not that difficult. And I think what we want to do is people habitually, just like looking both ways before you cross the street, I think we want people to habitually think about the risks they're about to take. And I don't want to talk about go or no go. I don't think you have to quit flying or not do flights. I think you need to think about how can we go with less risk. Do we go at a different time of the day? Do we go a different route to avoid weather? Do we change airplanes to more capable? I'd like to figure out, other than go no go, how we mitigate risk. Any more comments, JD?
Yes, I've got a question from Curtis, who's asking, how do PAVE and CARE cost more money?
How do they?
Did we say that they cost more money? I don't remember that. But,
well, it's going to tie back to safety costs money.
okay.
Well, safety equipment costs money. Excuse us if we didn't make that clear, John. So
yeah. The cockpit voice recorders cost money. A lot of the things we put in the
flight data
aircraft.
recorders,
Right.
2 engines instead of 1 engine, turbine engines instead of piston engines, 2 crew in the cockpit. This kind of safety equipment adds obviously weight. Having good fire extinguishing on all of the engines.
There are people who say that if you take off in a single engine airplane, you're making a bargain with the devil. You're taking a risk because that single engine might quit, and you're just simply taking that risk. Having a twin engine airplane costs money. I guess that's how. And PAVE and CARE.
The habit of risk management with PAVE and CARE in and of itself doesn't cost money, but it might cost money, for instance, if you decide that on the trips that you regularly take, maybe you fly regularly from, let me take a local example, San Diego over the mountains to Reno, Nevada, and you're doing that trip maybe a couple times a week. And you decide, you look at the risks and you say, well, I think that I need to do this in a twin rather than a single engine airplane. Well, you have cost some money there.
Well, and PAVE and CARE don't directly cost money.
They don't directly
but the
cost
results
money.
of the decisions you make to mitigate risk, for instance, carrying more fuel on every flight, landing with a higher fuel reserve, that costs money.
Mm-hmm.
So the results of the decisions you make to mitigate risk very often do. What else we have, JD?
I've got another question here and comment from Jason, who said he's worked with pilots that fly jets and have gone to the best schools in the world, but he's seen that when they leave school and they get out in the airlines and charters and everything that they're doing, they're not doing pre-flight checks, they're not using checklists, they're not doing their weight and balance and performance data. And his question is, how do we make that safer? How do you change people's attitudes?
You change their habits is what you do. I'm shocked shocked under the idea that people aren't using checklists and standard operating procedures. The people I see that fly turbine aircraft do use checklists and do use standard operating procedures.
They're very careful to do so.
Yeah.
In the turbine world, part of the way you do that is with more structure regarding dispatchers, if there's a second pilot on board, creating a culture with more feedback regarding competence and compliance with the procedures.
I know where part of this thinking may come from is a lot of times you use a flow check, which leads you to a standard operating procedure. A checklist doesn't necessarily mean you have to look at a piece of paper. A checklist means you follow a standard operating procedure, including a flow check, or get a piece of paper back and go back and look at it.
It's not a do list. It's a checklist. But
Right.
as you say, in a lot of turbine aircraft, there's a very set flow pattern. You start here and you move across this way and down here, and here's you know what you're looking for, and you just follow that flow pattern. Possibly that's what he's thinking about.
Yeah, I don't know, but the people I know who fly turbine aircraft are following standard operating procedures. And it could be part of a flow check, or it could be part of a checklist. A checklist, in my thinking, doesn't necessarily mean a piece of paper. You don't have to have a piece of paper. There's a lot of ways you can do it.
But I think part of the point is, as a community, as peers of those people, we need to not accept that behavior. We need to point out to them that they're not exercising good risk management, and there have been some very classic nasty crashes in business turbine aircraft because of the pilots not doing full checklists every flight.
Well, people not checking their controls.
Right, and not knowing until they reach too high a speed to stop that they won't be able to rotate and get off the runway, things like that. Yeah. And in our community, we have sometimes let behavior like that slide because nobody wants to squeal, if you will, on anyone else. But the problem is that behavior like that, when it leads to those kinds of dramatic, sensational accidents in particular, is a real damage to the entire community because of what it does regarding the public perception of the aviation community.
Martha and I fly a small jet, and we go every year to get a pilot proficiency exam which required for us to fly that jet. And we get evaluated on our crew resource management, and we get evaluated on our following standard operating procedures. And we wouldn't make it through there unless we did follow those procedures, and I think it's a good thing. I think we're far better pilots for it. JD, any more comments here?
I do. I've got another question here from George. He says, have flight examiners changed the way that they're evaluating student pilots since the start of the ACS in 2014?
I believe that they have more guidance than they used to have in evaluating pilots. Yes, I believe so. I think it's a fair statement.
I believe, just from our own check rides, that all along a good designated pilot examiner will have been exercising some degree of risk management evaluation of the applicant that is before them, but what they didn't have was good, solid criteria, standards that they could point to and say, this person didn't have a habit or an awareness or whatever about risk management. And what they would have to do is what any designee can do if they really want to. They'd have to find something else that they could down the pilot on if they really didn't think that their physical skills might mostly be there, but if what's between the ears isn't really where it should be, they didn't have any guidance and standards that technically allowed them to reject a pilot on that basis. And now they've got that, and that's a huge improvement. And I've gotten quite a bit of feedback because I go to DPE meetings here in San Diego from DPEs that they like
Designated pilot examiners. Right. I think most people here would know that.
That they like having the criteria and the leg to stand on when they get people that they think just really don't think about, they're not situationally aware, and they don't think about what's going on out there. They're physically good, but as far as their environment, they're just not aware.
I think what we're doing is we're changing the focus on evaluating pilots. It used to be we evaluated the practical test standards. We're focused on the pilot's skill, physical skills in handling the aircraft. Now we're focusing more on, is this pilot truly ready to be pilot in command of this aircraft? Are they ahead of the aircraft? Are they identifying the risks, and are they coming up with mitigation strategies for the risk? Would you want your family flying with them if they were the pilot in command? And I think that's what our focus is now.
And the kind of mitigation strategies we're talking about, John touched on some of this, is if you've got a particular trip and you look at it with the PAVE checklist, and things are not adding up very well, you don't have to necessarily just flat out cancel the trip. You can modify it. Maybe you go a day earlier. Maybe you take a different airplane if you've got a couple of alternatives that you could take. Maybe you change your route. Maybe you put in a fuel stop that you maybe didn't really have to have, just to make sure that you've got plenty of alternatives when you get to the other end, particularly if you're going to have to contend with weather or busy airspace and so on. There was about a month ago, there was a Teterboro Airport got shut down because one of the airplanes landing there had a gear collapse right at the intersection of their two runways where they crossed each other, shut the whole airport down for about 2 hours. So, do you have alternatives for things like that? In other words, not just for weather, but for other eventualities.
Let's talk about why people might not mitigate risks. There's two groups of people who might not, when they figured out there's a risk, might not mitigate that risk. One group, I don't really know how to deal with this group, is people who are thrill seekers. They actually love risk. They seek out risk. It makes them feel, I guess, important. They have fun. They enjoy risk. It's going to be hard to get those people to give up on risk, to mitigate the risk. The second group is most of us here together today. We're people who are movers and shakers in our community. We get things done. We just like to
we're goal-oriented.
We're goal-oriented. We're used to, we're in a habit of completing what we set out to do. And it's hard to make yourself give up on completing what you set out to do. And why we don't do this is that EQ thing. There's always a trade-off between achieving something or accomplishing something and risk. And particularly in an airplane, every time you get in an airplane, there's a trade-off between accomplishing what you want to do and risk. And your emotional way you deal with giving up on things, your maturity,
or modifying things, just changing things,
determines whether or not you're willing to make a change in what you would like to have, like we'd like to accomplish. So there's always that trade-off there, and so as if you were evaluating a pilot and you want to know, are they going to be trustworthy and reliable? You'd have to know, how are they about just this trade-off between achieving something and risk? And you have to make that trade-off every time you fly an aircraft. And so as an evaluator, you'd be very interested in that trade-off and what do we have to worry about.
JD, do we have any update on those earlier poll numbers?
I do, Martha. We're currently up to 198 respondents on the poll, and out of that, 133 have responded yes, which is 67%.
Who knows someone personally who was killed in a general aviation aircraft accident? Wow, isn't that? We can do better than that, folks, and we need to do better than that. And so how do we do better? Well, you are the right people. You're a bunch of flight instructors, and we are imploring you, exercise leadership. And what we want you to do is get pilots, teach pilots who learn how to develop the habit of identifying the risks of flight and mitigating those risks. And we would like you to encourage pilots to be introspective about what might make them resistant to mitigating risk. What about their personalities would make them resistant to mitigating risk? So we encourage you, we beg of you, let's change these numbers. This is unacceptable. We can't allow this to go on.
It threatens the future of our community.
Please exercise leadership. The future of our community depends on it. And while you're at it, if you're not already a member of NAFI, join NAFI. It's one of the greatest things you can do. This sense of community ties us all together and fixes these kinds of problems. Your leadership is an important part of this. Please join NAFI and participate in this.
All you have to do is go to nafi.org, join. You'll have a fabulous mentoring program there, fabulous companionship, helping you to work with your learning pilots and to help shape the future of our community.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, folks. I hope you exercise leadership and change our community. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, John and Martha. Remember, to earn Wings credit for this course, click the button on the right side of your screen that says Earn Wings Credit. This will take you to the FAAsafety.gov site to review the course content and take the mastery quiz for Wings credit. Please don't forget to take a moment and complete a course evaluation for this broadcast. Your input helps NAFI provide better features and benefits. We very much appreciate the extra time you take. The NAFI Mentor Live program is provided to aviators free of charge. Your contributions will help NAFI to continue to produce this and many other educational programs and content. Please donate and support NAFI's educational programs designed specifically for CFIs to increase their knowledge, skills, and professionalism. The Mentor Live page lists the upcoming broadcasts and archive broadcasts. Please feel free to share these links with your students and your aviation friends. Don't forget to save the date. Next month's Mentor Live will be Insurance Claims, What They Can Teach Us, and will be presented by Mike Adams, Senior Vice President, Underwriting of Memco Insurance Company. This is Bob Mader. Thanks again for watching, and fly safe.